those of you who are Felician Associates, my name is Sister Kathleen Osbelt. I go by Sister Kathy to make it short. And we're going to start today with the prayer service that is in the packet you got. It's called Clare's Departure. We're starting off with a prayer service that depicts Clare's leaving her home to make this incredible commitment. Perhaps as we go through this day on our retreat, we will be able to grasp the gravity of that commitment. If we were in Italy, we would be walking to these different stops. We begin with the person reading stop 1.
Early life of Clare. How many goodbyes did Clare say? When did she say those goodbyes? Reluctantly goodbyes to Assisi when her family fled to Perugia. Goodbye to toys, to other things, in the abandoned house to friends in Assisi. On this Palm Sunday at midnight, goodbye to Papa and Mama or Fiducio. Goodbye to her very own life, with all its security and power and status. Goodbye to nobility, goodbye. But for Clare, they were hellos too. Hello to the penitents, right as they were very spot. Hello to the faces of the Perusians, who distrusted her family, but still allowed them to resettle for a time in Perugia. Hello to Francis and his brothers, right here in Assisi. And on Palm Sunday, at the hour of midnight, hello to Christ, her beloved. Draw me after you, O heavenly spouse, and I will run to the aroma of your perfume, and I will not tire. Goodbye, hello. Clare ran to her beloved spouse.
Together we will sing. Stop 2.
Clare, like other noble women of Assisi, has defined herself in terms of her own family. The men of the family are knights, and so the women are the very summit of the social scale. The downside is that they live very restricted lives, enclosed within the boundaries of their own homes and the customs of the nobility, like arranged marriages and no juridical guarantees once their spouse has died. The women were defined in terms of the feudal lords. Now, Clare is leaving that prestigious but confining world. What are her thoughts?
Gaze upon Christ, consider Christ, contemplate Christ, contemplate Christ. Gaze upon Christ, consider Christ, contemplate Christ, contemplate Christ. And here we have the young woman, Clare, who was called as one who had been raised in an environment of prayer. A mother, an aunt, sisters who prayed frequently in the home, but she who was touched by a particular something that made her burn with a desire for Jesus. Always, she saved part of the delicacies from their table to give to the poor. Always, she sent bread to those who were in want and money to those who were building the churches that had to be rebuilt in Assisi. And she was given a sign from the bishop that this was the time. And she would be called to answer to her beloved Jesus. Stop 3.
Francis' deeds were known to the entire city. Word spreads quickly to this small town. What do the neighbors know about what is going on? What has Clare heard about Francis? Does she know of the sale of the cloth of Foligno? The encounter before the San Damiano crucifix? Did she go down and gaze on the same face of Christ? Francis begging for stones to rebuild San Damiano, stripping before Bishop Guido and Pietro's wrath. Did the mothers Ortolana and Pica speak to each other during these days, trying to understand what was happening to their children? When and where did Clare first hear Francis preach? In this neighborhood somewhere? When did the fire within her begin to grow? Where in this city did she and Francis meet as she continued to discern God's call? And what did the neighbors say about this? Did they even know?
Gaze upon Christ, consider Christ, contemplate Christ, contemplate Christ. Gaze upon Christ, consider Christ, contemplate Christ, contemplate Christ. And here is the piazza where Clare's home was. One of the very richest homes in Assisi. It was known that that home had many servants, many who would have waited on Clare, on her sisters, on her mother and aunts, who would have prepared the food when 7 knights would come back from their various expositions. Clare was located right next to the Cathedral of San Rufino, where Francis spoke, and where she would have heard someone like herself burning with the desire to follow in the footprints of Jesus. Stop 4.
Clare has now crossed the boundary between the majors and the minors. She stops near the shop of Pietro Bernardone. Here, the poor work dyeing the cloth, far removed from the nightly pursuits of her father's house. Near here, Francis is said to have been born in a stable like his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. What does it mean to cross those invisible borders between privilege and distinction and disenfranchisement, marginality and amenity? What is implied when this noble woman crosses over to the other side, where there is little or no education, no luxuries, only the burden of repetitive, uninteresting, and demeaning work. What gospel passages come to her mind? Is there a further identification with Christ in this small physical, large psychological, and spiritual border crossing?
Gaze upon Christ, consider Christ, contemplate Christ, contemplate Christ. Gaze upon Christ, consider Christ, contemplate Christ, contemplate Christ. And here we see the Cathedral of San Rufino. There were a few meetings between Francis and Clare. She was about 18. He would have been around 23 or 24. And we know that he had permission from the Pope to preach repentance. And in her hearing of his words, she knew that this is what she wanted, to follow very directly in the footprints of Jesus. And so for her, living high up in Assisi with her family, a noble, it would have been the Italians call it fida vergura. In other words, a terrible, terrible insult to her family to leave and to go down and outside the walls to where those who didn't even have a title were. So she would have been well known as her family was known. In fact, Clare had a reputation in the town because of her goodness and her holiness. However, no one knew that she had made her personal vow of virginity and had promised herself and eventually her parents that she was not going to marry. So all of these people who lived in this area would have known this Clare, who leaves this house secretly at night and goes through the alleyways under darkness. She would have had a companion who went with her. They would have known the way by heart because this was their town. So through the alleyways, she would have gone to meet the friars. The view from the place of meeting point would have been the whole valley of Spoleto. We believe that the bishop was in on this leaving, this departure, because there's no other way that the guard of the city would not have known or would not have seen her. There is no other way that the gates would have been opened except had the bishop not made a resolution that she would be safe in her passage.
Did it ever occur to Clare before how many choices she had? When life seemed to be predetermined, didn't she still have a choice? Didn't she choose the life of penance as a virgin? And didn't she choose not to hate the Asciani for driving the noble families away? Didn't she choose to give food to the poor and to distribute her patrimony? Looking at the people who live here in this part of Assisi, how many choices did they ever have? And seeing the lepers, Mother of God, what possible choices could they have? Unclean, people cried. Unclean, unclean. How many times did Clare come to this very place? Always accompanied by a maid and a knight. And how many times did Clare turn back and run home? Choices, yes. Clare made many choices. She could still turn around now and run home. But where would her home be now? Would she ever be able to get back inside? Would she be able to return after all these choices? at this place, did she wonder if she had made the best choice on this Palm Sunday night?
This is the gate. This is the Porta Moiano, one of the oldest gates of Assisi. This would have been guarded and, as I said, locked. Clare would have stood here because this is the boundary. Once you leave outside the walls, you become a part of the, not even the minorities, but those that don't count at all. You would have been a part of those that were called serfs or slaves. And certainly if you encountered a leper, and worse yet, touched a leper, you would have been dead to the world, as every leper was dead to the world. So at this place, she must have stood, realizing the gravity of her choice to leave behind wealth, the command of many estates, the possibility of marrying great wealth, of being a lady, a countess, a baroness perhaps, of having sons and daughters that would have also been nobility. She left it all at this point. Next stop, please.
Having made up her mind, did she pause to consider her decision one more time? From here, the valley must have looked very dark and forbidding. Who was guarding the gate? Were they asleep? The gate is close to Bishop Guido's house, the bishop who earlier this day gave her the palm at Mass. Did he help her get past Porta Moiano? Clare decides to walk through this gate, no longer able to keep the fire which is blazing contained within.
So as we sit here looking at this gate, I'd like to ask you to close your eyes and imagine being in the middle of that gate. A gate that behind you are decisions that you have made. And before you are places where those decisions will still take you. Think for just a moment about the weightier, the heavier, the profound decisions you have made in your life. Let us now thank God for the grace that has been given to us to be faithful to those decisions. And now the unknown before her. Gaze upon the vast expanse of the valley, open and free. There are no boundaries there. Could Clare see the Maddalena Chapel and the Porta Moiano from here? Absolutely not. She went out into the unknown. But looking back, see how narrow and confining this gate looks with its tiny slit windows. It is meant to keep people out. Clare can never return here as a woman of nobility. One can see the present Basilica of St. Chiara from here. But Clare could never have imagined that in this new place would be represented nearly 800 years of loyal discipleship on the part of her sisters. The Basilica of Santa Chiara today holds the two most precious Franciscan symbols. The San Damiano cross, as you see up here. This is the cross that spoke to Francis, "Go rebuild my church." which is now hanging in the Basilica in the Chapel of the Cross, and also the body of Clare, which is in the Basilica. So haven't we also received a call to go and rebuild God's church, which we know is falling into ruin? Particularly these days, don't we have an obligation to help others who are in the search and to not give up and to know that God still continues to call us to rebuild the church? Aren't we all called as Franciscans to be part of one family, to make up the body of Christ? Who is the center of and the soul of both Francis and Clare? This call from Christ. This is our call, and this is our challenge. And so we sing, What You Hold. What you hold, may you always hold. What you do, may you always do, and never abandon, never abandon.
But with swift pace, light step, unswerving feet, so that even your steps stir up no dust. Go forward securely, joyfully and swiftly on the path of prudent happiness.
What you hold, may you always hold. What you do, may you always do, and never abandon, never abandon. All right, so what I'd like to point out here is that Clare is the eldest. And, in the nobility, in the families of nobility at the time of Clare, now we're talking, you have the dates here, so we're talking the 12th century, but really the best of the 13th century as well. And we're talking about the fact that Clare would have been trained as someone who would have been in charge of many estates, not just one. Having been from the family of 7 knights, knighthood was considered on your way up, if you will. So you got paid as a knight with money. In our own country, those of you, I don't think anybody's alive that remembers the Revolutionary War, but those who fought in the Revolutionary War were paid with money. For instance, the whole tract of Fayetteville, basically, was a payment given to a Mr. Armstrong. This would have been 3-4 generations ago. And they eventually gave off some lands to sell and some lands for the state park. But that was how they were able, because we were a new country. There was no currency to be given to those that fought in the Revolutionary War. Same goes true in the 13th century Assisi or any of the Italian city-states. The city-states were constantly warring over property and land because land meant revenue. If you had land, you could tax anyone who crosses your land. You could tax anyone who crosses your waterways or uses the waterways. You could demand a fee for anyone who's on the roads or goes through the tolls on your roads. They were the earliest toll roads. They're throughways. So if you had land, you had wealth. for instance, Francis's father, Pietro, we know today, I have maps that show how much land he owned, and it was a hefty piece of property. Early on, when Francis and the brothers were staying at a place called Riva Torto, when they came back from Rome, they were actually staying on his father's property. It wasn't in Assisi, it was in another village, but it just goes to show you the rising class, the merchant class, were able to garner more money because they had land, and then they would buy more land to garner even more money. Clare would have been a chip, a very, very valuable chip in the family of anyone that she was betrothed to. She would have been a prize, not just because of her beauty and the holiness of this woman, but because of the wealth that came with her. So women at that time were really chattel. By that I mean they were not seen as valuable in and of themselves. They were seen as a convenience for gathering more wealth and more land. And if you weren't a noble, well, and you were a woman, forget it. You didn't have anything going for you except hard labor. And that hard labor would be either to help your husband as a merchant or as a laborer. Or you would have been a serf yourself, working the fields, or taking care of pigs or whatever. So I just wanted to point out, she was the oldest, and it says that very cursory in the first line there, but that meant a lot in terms of what she had going for her. It meant also that her dowry would have been very hefty, and we know that she gave that dowry to the poor, even before she went off to follow the brothers. We know also that Clare had a holiness before she even heard Francis. She had her own call, independent. Now, we know in her own writings, she calls herself the little plant of Francis, but we know that she herself was someone who felt her own call and her own burning desire to follow the footprints of Jesus. Now, where did these two get this idea, Francis and Clare? Nothing comes from nothing. In those days, in the medieval period, there was the largest movement ever of itinerant beggars who declared themselves as under the church, as people who were, they might even call themselves lesser brothers or lesser sisters. So there were many movements of the day, but they did not all go to the Pope and ask for blessing as Francis did. Now, Clare saw herself as being able to join in with the brothers and do the same thing. Problem being, that's not how the men of the day saw it. And by that I mean not only the church authorities, but also the government authorities. They lived in a period, the feudal period, which was very pyramidical. Everything was on a pyramid. Now, how many of you built castles and moats and all that when you were in the 5th or 6th grade? Do you remember doing that? Yes. Okay, it was a lot of fun. You know, and there was great romance about all that and the knights and, you know, exciting time to live. I wish I lived in that time. Well, no. No. It was a very savage time. It would not be unusual to walk the streets of Assisi at that time and find someone dead in a gutter. And because it was a medieval time long before any conveniences that we're used to came about, anyone who lived higher in the village or in the city of Assisi, and that goes for any of the mountain villages that you see throughout Italy, their refuse would have gone down to those that were living at the bottom, right? So that means all kinds of trash. That also means that those at the top of the heap were better protected than those at the bottom of the mountains. So you see all these city-states in Italy built on mountainsides for good reason, because of the incredible constant warring that went on. I'd also like to point out, and you can go through this later, but it just talks about how Clare was joined later on. But I don't want to miss over the point that when she was about 5 or 6, we're not sure about the year, but when she went to Perugia during that Civil War, she met girls that she became playmates with. They were also of the nobility, because Perugia, which was about 10 miles west of Assisi, would have been the city of nobles. So her family was very comfortable in Perugia. And while she was there, she had playmates who eventually joined her at the monastery. So San Damiano has some of that from her early days. Interesting also, while she was in Perugia with her family taking refuge because the merchant class was rising up against the nobles, who else was in Perugia? Francis. And where was he? He was in a prison, which at that time would have been a quarry. And we can imagine what a quarry was like at night. No conveniences, food would have been thrown down. And I am sure that any Assisian, like Clare's family, would have known which Assisians were in that prison at that time. So there were more connects than we have officially written here. Okay, and let's just go to the next page. Talks about other places where monasteries were opened. So Clare's reputation and the holiness of the monastery was carried to Germany, to Prague, to Spain. How did that happen? Well, that happened because of the friars. When they went to these places and were preaching, and women approached them and said, "We too feel called to follow as you are," they wanted to know how to do this, and so the friars began to talk about the monastery of San Damiano, and that's why we have so many other monasteries that opened up in early Europe. And also, if you read this carefully, you'll see how Clare's life had to deal with 4, not 1, not 2, but 4 popes. Always, she was true to the church. Always, she remained in the church, but always she stood her ground as one committed to the way being the way of the gospel. So she would never give in to anything that did not put charity first, or humility first, or poverty first. Doesn't matter if it came from the Pope. She would find a way to hold fast to these values. So let us begin then talking a little bit about this woman who was a leader, a sister, a mother, and most definitely a mystic. So, as I said earlier, the way of governing, both in the church and in the civic populace, was a pyramid. So you would have at the top of that pyramid, of course, the emperor. And under the emperor would be kings who would have delegated to them certain areas. And under the kings, you would have prince and princesses and duke. And then you would have an earl, a baron, and then the knight. In some places, they took on different names because of the countries, okay? So under the church, the pyramid would start with the Pope, And then under the Pope would be the cardinals, just as you have it today. And then the bishops, and then the priests, they called them canons, and then the deacons. The Pope had an interesting relationship with the emperor and with the kings. The Pope had the authority because this was a world of Christendom. Because why? Constantine, 337, the empire would be Christian. Okay, so the Pope had the authority to excommunicate a king. Remember all the problems with England, with all the Henrys? Okay, so the Pope had also a great, voracious, you might say, appetite for lands also. How was the Pope going to get lands? Well, what did the Pope have at his dispense? He had the option to give indulgences. So anyone who would be a knight to gain lands and control of lands would gain an indulgence. So wealth was at the bottom of all of it. You getting the picture here? Okay, so it was a society not much different than our own in some areas, really, in some ways. The climb was about getting more wealth. Wealth meant power. More power meant more wealth, more comfortability, more security for my family. We will be looked up upon with great esteem. All of this was a drive, both in the church and in civic experiences. So, comes along our friends Francis, Clare, and their cronies, and they're seeing what this drive is doing to the people. Wealth is gained on the backs of others. Not to mention the murdering, the divisions, and the constant threat to life. The degradation of that which is sacred. So it was an authoritarian world, and what was it built on? Fear. Does this ring true to anything that's happening today? Absolutely. To put fear in the people was to get them to come to your understanding, your perception of how things ought to be. So if I put enough fear into you, if I instill fear over your properties, you're going to fight for them. And then you will fight for the city-state. And then you will fight for the king. And women at this time, as I said, were just chattel. If you were unmarriageable, and or if you were a wealthy widow, you would end up in a monastery. Those were the only choices, ladies. Either you're married or off with you to a monastery. Because of this, the monasteries also were powerful. So you had a wealthy widow join the monastery. Guess where all her money went? With her to the monastery. So monasteries had armies. Monasteries had lands, lots of land. And they collected the revenue off those lands. They had their own cemeteries. They had their own slaves and serfs. So the abbess or the abbot would have some powers equal to that of a bishop. And they would be able to pretty much control their monastery without any interference, except for the women, of course. For the women to go outside the walls of their monastery, they would have to have permission from either a local abbot or from the bishop. However, they still lived a comfortable life in most of the monasteries. So at that time also, women were seen as, because of some of the writings that people were passing around at the time, women were seen as temptations to sin. They were seen, well, you know, Adam and Eve was taken literally. The Genesis story was taken literally. And so the writings were meant to stay away from, be vigilant about women. And so women also were weak, and they had to be protected also. So how does that go together? Well, it looks something like women were encouraged to remain virgins. Now, at this time, Clare would have known about Agnes of Rome because everybody had a festival. We got St. Patrick's Day coming up, right? What goes on St. Patrick's Day? Just tell me. Parades, drinking, what else? Dancing, right. Eating, partying, okay. Same thing went on the feast of St. Agnes of Rome. St. Agnes of Rome lived in the 3rd century. We're not really very sure about the legend, but it goes like this. She was of a noble family, Christian. She was made to worship an idol, which she refused. So she was put in and she would not break her vow of virginity. And so she was put in a brothel to be made to break her vow. And she somehow escaped that. And so they put her to death. So if you want women to follow a model, what do? You raise up that model, right? So every year in all the Italian city-states, there would be parades and processions and parties and feasting on the feast of Agnes of Rome. There were prayers written up for Agnes of Rome. There was a whole office, you know, Liturgy of the Hours, written up for Agnes of Rome. There was a special mass, and she was included in the Eucharistic prayer. So that's a lot. And what did it do? It was a model for young women to keep themselves pure and virginal and Christian. And so this was how women were seen and held up. In fact, if you were to read Clare's letters, she quotes very heavily from the office and the legend of St. Clare. When she writes her letters, of St. Agnes, when she writes her letters to Agnes of Prague, the different Agnes, she quotes all of the life of Agnes of Rome. And I frequently will take pilgrims to the cathedral that Constantia, who's Constantia? She's the daughter of, who? Constantine, exactly. She had a basilica built right in the middle of one of the piazzas in Rome to celebrate Agnes of Rome. And that's where, in fact, that's where her remains are buried, so to speak. Okay, so let's get back to what's happening around Clare's life. Council of the Fourth Lateran Council said no more new rules. No more new rules. Well, this didn't bother Clare in the beginning because she really had it in her mind that she was going to follow what Francis had written out in terms of the Gospels. He strung together quotes from the Gospel, and this was the rule that the friars followed. So this is a no-brainer. Jesus asked us to follow him. I want to follow in the footprints just like the brothers and the sisters with me. We're going to follow the same rule. Not so easy. So at the same time, the Pope said, every group who follows a rule, if they want a new rule, they have to follow the rule of Saint Benedict. So Pope after Pope after Pope is trying to get Clare to adhere to the rule of Saint Benedict. Now, I'll tell you in just a moment how that happens. So Pope Honorius II he says, well, okay, I don't like all these women living in these monasteries. I don't know what they're doing. I think we need more control. And so let's have all of the monasteries throughout the empire follow the same rule. That would be the rule of Saint Benedict. And Cardinal Ugolino, who later becomes Pope Gregory IX, who gives Clare again a hard time, gives them this rule. Now, this rule is really tough. It was rigid in lifestyle. For instance, total enclosure. You may never leave the monastery. Fasting that they had to adhere to no matter where in the empire they lived. Now think about that. Not the same kinds of foods are available north of the Alps that might be available in southern Italy, right? They had to have a steady income so they could be independent. This was a real tough situation for Clare, because already she and the sisters at San Damiano were living according to the charity of Christ, and none of this would have been the way that she would rule. So Clare struggled with this authoritarian kind of living. And let me tell you how she got around this. The sisters, when they had to testify at her canonization, they said, prayer and fasting and almsgiving was so important to Clare. But she was never rigid about anything. And so even in the way that she ran the monastery, she would have taken down some of that rigidity. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But Clare never would have known the words I, mine, or just me. She never would have been able to uphold the kind of life where she would be a climber. She was, as a sister, as a mother, as a leader, she was the perfect model of a servant leader. In her great humility, what she was doing is she was copying the crucified Christ that she saw constantly self-emptying, constantly. When she wrote to Agnes of Prague, in one of her letters, she said, "The Lord of heaven and earth is laid to rest in a manger. Consider also the midst of his life, his humility, or at least his blessed poverty, the countless hardships, and the punishment that he endured for the redemption of the human race. Ponder the final days of the mirrored one, contemplate the ineffable love with which he was willing to suffer on the tree of a cross and die there to a kind of death that is more shameful than anything." So she's telling Agnes of Prague, who's just starting out, Agnes, I want you to look at the cross. But she's not looking at the actual day of crucifixion. It's what she had available, okay? They didn't have Bibles. They heard the stories from the visiting preachers. They didn't have Bibles available to them. They didn't have Thomas à Kempis's Life of Christ. She had a cross, and she knew the gospel. And what they would ruminate over and over and over again are the beginning of Jesus' life. Imagine the creator of the whole universe, the Lord of everything. And by the way, the term Lord, they used it for Lord Pope, and they used it for the Lord King. So when Jesus was called Lord, that's why much of the persecution started happening. So anyway, Clare is saying, just try to get your mind around the fact that God so loves us, that God gave up everything to come and be with us. Now, Clare would have understood a little bit of what that's like, right? She gave up nobility, she gave up wealth, she gave up a future, she gave up her family in a big way. So now she's just carrying that out, thinking, oh, well, if I gave that up, imagine what Jesus gave up. So then she continues through the Gospels, and she's saying, but that's not all. Look at what Jesus did for the people. There was nobody who was excluded. There was no one who Jesus did not give a word of compassion to. There was no one that Jesus didn't call inside the circle. So Clare was a woman of great charity. Now she's assigning that to Jesus and looking at the way Jesus gave to everyone a word, an encouragement, and the promise of love. And then she says, okay, and now look at the end of his life. How he died this torturous, horrible death and did it for us. Now, you don't get self-emptying more than that. Look at that life. It's a one long life of self-emptying. There was no ego there. No ego. And so she's saying this to Agnes. Look at Agnes. You want to know the way? Here's the way. Look at his life. So, we make a big deal out of Clare 40 years looking at the San Damiano cross. But what she was really looking at was the life of Jesus as a model. And the word mirror was very popular in spiritual writing in that day. And so Clare uses the word mirror. And she says, there it is. He's the mirror. And we have to look like him. So that when we turn around to our brothers and sisters, we're the mirror. And we begin to mirror for others. Okay? So this is what she wrote constantly about the self-emptying so that we can attain the poverty, the humility, and the charity of Christ. So Clare would say also, one becomes what one loves. So on this retreat day, if you come away with anything, come away with that question, what do you love? Beside perhaps your partner or your friends or your family, what do you love? Clare had given up everything, including the family, so that she could become like the one she truly loved. And we know who that was. She wanted to become just like Christ. So her prayer always spilled out of that, how do I self-empty? How do I give of myself? How do I love my sisters? How do I love who comes to the door? How do I love even those that are opposing our lifestyle, aka the popes and their emissaries? How do I love the sister who is a troublemaker or one who is demented or sick? How do I love? And so throughout her life, she was the mirror for the sisters. She was the model for the sisters. She was open to plurality in her monastery. If she was in flesh in Christ, Christ was open to everyone in the Gospels. Therefore, whatever their physical or emotional status was, Clare loved them. And she encouraged her sisters to love in the same way. Clare was one who honored the diversity among her sisters. She knew that everyone had the same vocation. And in fact, my brothers and sisters here, we have the same vocation. We all have the same vocation. Religious, lay, doesn't matter. We all have the same vocation. Our vocation is to become another incarnation of the Word, another incarnation of Jesus. Richard Rohr wrote a whole book on how God needs images. Well, you're it. You're it. Another beautiful saying he has is God comes disguised as ourselves. We don't realize the power that we have because we have the ability to be that incarnation. So in other words, Jesus has many incarnations and is counting on you and me to be that, and has given us everything we need. Specifically, how Clare showed that is kind of a foot-washing leadership. You know, in the Gospel of John, John is the gospel that points out the actual Word made flesh. The divine Word came into flesh. It's a beautiful gospel to read when you doubt that you have divinity within you. All of us has divinity within us, all of us. And so John is pointing out that this divine one, in great humility, bends down to wash the feet of those who are around him. Jesus washed the feet in many ways, but he literally washes the feet at the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, and that replaces the breaking of the bread. But in the Gospel of John, as in the Synoptic Gospels, the same words are said. Do this in remembrance of me. Wash each other's feet in remembrance of me. We could do a whole day's retreat on how we wash each other's feet. Okay? And I'm not just talking about Holy Thursday either. When she washed the feet of those that came in from the streets, we know that those streets were traveled by the animals. So we know the garbage was put out on the streets. And when it rained, it all mixed together. And that's what she washed. And she kissed the feet afterwards of those who had been out on the streets. Why would her sisters be out on the streets? Probably to deliver some of the linens that they made, or to pick up food that was promised the monastery. So she was one who, she would prefer love over violence. Again, she's moving away from the values of her own civilization. She showing, as being a model, a mirror for the sisters, contemplation over conflict, graciousness over discourtesy, gentleness over harshness, and remembrance over refusal. She was all about partnerships, that everyone would be seen on equal ground. There would be a reciprocity and a unity. Now remember, she's the abbess. She could have had all kinds of power and control, and she refused all of it. She's the one who really saw the gifts in sisters and would call those gifts out. She was so sure of her own identity, she was not threatened by the gifts of somebody else. She was so happy to advance someone else. In fact, she sent the sisters out to start other monasteries in other cities. She did not go herself. She entrusted that work to the ability of others as well. And that's how the community built up. They would have their weekly gatherings as a community, and the novices would have as much of a voice as all of the other sisters were. Again, it was all about unity and the fact that there was no one who would be seen as little, seen as least. They had weekly chapters. Some of the sisters in this room would remember that. Chapter of Faults, where the sisters would go into a room and they would have to say what they did wrong that week. Sister, I broke a plate. Or sister, I under my breath, I called someone a name, whatever. Clare would be the first one to go every week. She would be the first one to kneel down and beg forgiveness from the sisters for whatever it was, and I can't even imagine what that might be. She was the one who emptied the commodes of the 6 sisters. She was the one who would take the hay out, clean off the fleas from the sisters and bring in new hay for the sick sisters. She's the one who would walk around at night and cover the sisters that were sick, especially from the cold. She's the one who would make sure that everyone had enough to eat. And some of the miracles, in fact, were her was the ability for her to, at one point in time, create more bread. At another time, the Pope was visiting her. She asked him to bless the bread. He said, "No, you bless it." She blessed it, and all these crosses appeared on the rolls. She had a lot of courage. Obviously, standing there at that gate, it took a lot of courage to move secretly out of her home. She had a lot of courage to give away the food from the family that they had so much extra. She had courage to give away her own dowry. She had the courage to live this radical poverty. In fact, Francis said, well, okay, there were about 5 of them in the monastery. And at one point he said, okay, I see that you're able to put up with the cold, and in our case, the heat. You're able to put up with hunger. You're able to put up with loneliness and vulnerability. Remember, they were living outside the walls. You're able to put up with threats. I give you this rule to follow. In other words, he saw that they could do it. And so he blessed them with the words of the rule to follow as his brothers did. As abbess, she never wanted the title. It was Francis that said, Clare, if you don't take the title abbess, they will not see you as a monastery. And the authorities will move in and take control. She wanted to be called Ancilla, which means servant, favorite servant. But she complied to Francis's order to take the name abbess, but she never worked out of that title, ever. She was one who really had the sisters come together for consensus to make all their decisions. In fact, if you go to San Damiano, you see a podium like this, a wooden podium, and there are signatures of 50 sisters, and it was the decision to sell property that was attached to the monastery property. But it was a consensus that all 50 had to sign. She could have done it by herself as abbess, and she would refuse. She would rather do jobs herself than ask others to do it. That was her leadership by role model. I have been asked several times when we are at the leprosarium, when we are below Assisi, whether Clare would have worked with the friars. We have evidence that she did work in the early days before they were enclosed in the monastery. So Clare was probably one who would have been ostracized even before there was any brouhaha with her family, because she would have gone down and ministered with the brothers for those that had leprosy. The ritual over someone who has leprosy is a requiem of death. So if you had leprosy, and AKA a form of some kind of skin lesion or rash could have been noted as leprosy, even if it wasn't, then you would have been put down into either the female or the male leprosarium. There was San Rufino, which is still existing today. There are sisters there who host groups that come. And there's La Maddalena, which is a small chapel left of the women's leprosarium. So we do believe that Clare would have had the experience of working with lepers. Francis, on the other hand, he made the new members of the order live and work with the lepers, because that was the process of conversion. That if you weren't willing to lower yourself and be one with those brothers and sisters that were extricated, that were marginalized, then you didn't belong, being a lesser brother. And Clare called she and her own sisters the lesser sisters. Okay, today it has morphed into poor Clares, but it was the lesser sisters. In other words, they wanted nothing to do with the title of maggiore and even minore, because the merchants were among the minores. But they didn't even want the privileges that came with that label. So they were among the lesser, the least, as Scripture would have it. So before I move on then, any questions about her lifestyle or how she and the sisters lived in the monastery? There was one question of how she resisted the popes. I'll give you an example. In 1230, Pope Gregory IX, remember he was Cardinal Ugolini, who got all of the monasteries to follow the rule of St. Benedict. And Clare had to take on that rule, but she found reasons why people can come and go through the door, even though he said nobody can come in and out of the monastery. He made for strict fasting, and when Agnes of Prague, up north, was all in a buzz, writing to Clare and saying, Clare, what are we going to do? We have to follow these fasting rules, and we can't even get this food. And Clare is saying, calm down. Just keep your eyes on Jesus. And do what you can. Do what you can. She was not taking those kind of rules as the be-all, end-all of their lifestyle. And so she knew that they had to bend, particularly for the six sisters. When it came to talking, Clare would say in her rule, we should talk for the entertainment and service for the six sisters. Well, that meant all the sisters could, on occasion, talk. So hers was always about charity. It was always about being loving to each other. It was never about the law above people. So here's another example then of how she resisted. So in 1230, Pope Gregory IX put out this bull, which would be like a letter that people were meant to follow. So he puts out this bull to the friars, to the order of friars. And it's called Quo Linguati. And part of that was that the friars were allowed to have trustees to hold property for them. This was a real crush for Clare because it was so against poverty. A note here, just a little notation. Clare lived 27 years after Francis died. She held the original vision and dream of holding fast to gospel poverty. The friars were in convents. They had titles working for the bishops and for the Pope. They were already holding various curias within the Vatican. Clare held tight to the vision. And so that's why many of the early followers of Francis kept going back to Clare to help them keep that pure vision of following the footsteps of Jesus, particularly the gospel poverty. While the friars were now allowed to have property as long as it was in somebody else's name, and they used it. Also, Quo Linguati said that the brothers would from now on be restricted in their visiting the poor ladies. So this was a problem because Clare wanted to continue her relationship and the sisters' relationship with the friars. But now they would be limited to simply making sure that their temporal needs were taken care of, their food, and that they would be protected, and that's it. So Brother Elias, who became the Minister General, he really loved the sisters and Clare. and he was willing to keep the friars there, but the friar who followed him, who was the general, took Quo Longati literally and pulled the friars away. So Clare, in response, had a hunger strike with her sisters and said, if we cannot have the spiritual almoners, she called it, if we can't have our spiritual directors, we will not have our temporal goods either. If we can't have our spiritual goods, we can't have our temporal goods. In other words, if the friars cannot come and be our directors and homilists and give us what we need for spiritual welfare, forget the food. So they went on a hunger strike. And of course, the Pope gave in and made sure that they got a chaplain and that they would have the friars there with them. So that's just one case where she didn't leave the church, she didn't cause a rebellion, but she was very clear on a vision to which she was called, which I think is a great model for each of us. And where did all that come from? It came from her prayer. Any other questions that I could answer at this point? Yes?
How did she govern the community? I mean, really govern? They didn't have like a council member?
They did. They had a council. But anything that the council decided, they called all the sisters together to share with them and get consensus about it. I don't know how, I think that was part of the miracles that she did. Really. To have up to 100 women agreeing on something, really? So anything else about how they lived their lives or her relationship to Francis and the friars? Yes, Chris.
It mentions her illness here,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a prolonged illness.
Mm-hmm.
What was it, and how did that influence her governing of the community?
Okay, we're not sure exactly what that illness was. A lot of it she caused with the strict fasts that she held herself. That's not what she put on the sisters, but she fasted to the point where even the bishop and Francis asked her not to fast so much. But of course, in that case, Francis was the pot calling the kettle black, because we know that he died of malnutrition and tuberculosis, a different form of tuberculosis. So she was weakened, and it's very possible she too may have had a form of tuberculosis because it was rampant at that time. When Clare lived down in San Damiano, it was just marsh, swamp. And so malaria was at an all-time high. So that too would have been another disease that over time kept coming back to the sisters. So when they say the sisters are sick, they're not talking about a cold. They're talking about a much more severe diseases, because they would have put up with cold or flu, but we're talking about malaria and TB and the like, okay? Any other questions? So how did she govern? Okay, so while she was in bed, she did what she could to get up and take care of the sisters, but by that time, they were already moving in the same way that she had raised them, kind of. I say raised them, but she had been a model for so many years that they began to be a mirror for each other. You might say she was already passing on the nugget of the gospel of love to them. When she came out of prayer, they said that her face would be shining, that she had this brilliance about her. Remember, she is praying for over 40 years in front of that crucifix, and many times she'd get up during the night to pray. So how did she pray? Well, she didn't write tomes about how to pray, but we know that she left us enough through the letters of Agnes of Prague that we could kind of see what she was teaching. So we're all familiar. We just sang the music when we did our opening prayer. Gaze, consider, contemplate, and then imitate. So her movement was from the outside to the inside. So she would take what was around her and really look. There was a famous photographer who used to get incredible awards, and I wish I knew his name, but what I remember is what he said of how he gets these incredible pictures of, for instance, a rose. He would lay under that rose for hours and then ask permission of that rose to take her picture or his picture. And that's how he got these prize-winning awards. So that's the kind of looking that Clare is saying. Don't just, walk through a room and not be able to say what you saw. Okay, because our minds they're a beautiful organ of the body, but they're also a trap of the body, constantly going on. When we were trained as chaplains, part of our training was that when we came out of a room, we had to, the first part of our verbatim was to be able to write down every single thing that was in that room. How many cards were, if there were cards, were there flowers, were there, who was there, what did that person look like, was there anything else in the room, were there magazines, was there a rosary, was there anything. The whole purpose was to know what was going on possibly in the social life of that patient. So if it was stark and that person had already been there for a week, that tells you a lot. So that's the kind of looking that Clare is calling us to. Now, the next thing she says is to gaze. In other words, hold your look. Hold your look on whatever it is that you're being called to look at. In the case of Clare, it's Jesus. Gaze into his life. Don't just, that's Jesus on the cross. That's a beautiful Bible reading about the Good Samaritan. That's lovely about the forgiving father and the prodigal son. No, that would never be enough for Clare. To sit with it, to bring it inside of you. And that's what you do when you consider. You bring it inside of you and you ruminate it. A cow has many stomachs, and so they keep chewing. That's what you have to do with scripture or anything that's of nature, anything that's around us. Another person, we can make judgments just like that, can't we? Based on someone's past or how they look. But it's because we never take them in. We never take in their story. We never take in what they're saying. We never hold them in the deep regard as someone who has within them the Christ. So she's saying, take it in, and now contemplate. So contemplate is the point at which you let go. We're control freaks, aren't we? Right? And so contemplate means I now let it go and I just sit with that within me and let God cover me with God's grace. I just sit before the Lord. I don't know if anyone in here is familiar with Thomas Keating's work on centering prayer, or how many practitioners there might be here. So not wanting to bore you to death, let me just take a moment, because it's very much like what Clare is saying. Centering prayer is when I am not in control. When we are meditating on the scripture, we're pretty much in control because we're doing the thinking and then we do the praying. Even, in Lectio Divina, we read a piece of scripture or another sacred reading 3 times. And after the third time, we might offer up a prayer of how this has spoken to us. But still, that's coming out of the mind, right? And it is out of our minds that we often get tripped up. And so out of the work of Thomas Keating, Basil Pennington, and now Cynthia Burgault, Richard Rohr, all of those in the contemplative school are pointing up something that Jung brought to the fore many years ago, and that was that we have psychological traps. And there's basically 3 traps that the ego goes after for happiness. The first trap is wanting survival. Now that comes from our limbic brain back when we were lizards, you know. It's either you're going to run from it, or you're going to fight it, or you're going to eat it. So that's way back. So and I'll show you how this has evolved, but the other part of survival is security. I'm after my security. I think if I'm secure, I'll be happy. Now, how is it I'll be secure? Well, it's different for everybody. You might say for your security, you need always to be with your spouse or your friend. Or security for someone else is to always be in their house, or to always be the driver, and I can go on and on. What is it that makes you feel safe? Because now you're happy if you feel safe and comfortable. So that's one box, the survival security box. Another thing that trips our ego is the need for esteem or affection. You know, you worked hard on a project, somebody else got the credit. Ooh, trips your ego. You have appealed to someone, you've written cards, you've always been so thoughtful. Now you have a death in your family, you never hear from them. Ooh, trips your ego. So my need for esteem, people to look up to me or to love me, or these are motivations why I do things. And they always trip up my ego. The third box that we are often motivated by is power and control. I have to be right. Or this has to be done my way. Or I have to be the one in charge. Or even if I don't have to be in charge, I have to be the loudest one at the meeting. Power and control. So survival, security, esteem, affection, power, control. These are all the areas that we get tripped up. So for those who do centering prayer, you can't work out of the ego at all. Centering prayer is sitting. I say sitting because it's one way to give it 20 minutes without falling down, okay? So you sit with your feet flat, your back straight against a chair, and your hands on your lap, not touching, and you just go through relaxing the body. And I could go through that with you right now, but I'm afraid you'd all fall asleep with this heat. So once you're totally relaxed and your eyes are closed, you pick one word, and that word should be a very short word like Jesus or love or peace, whatever word comes to you in prayer. And that's you might say, your anchor, because you have to imagine the divine life in you like a river, deep river, okay? And so all of these boats are going to be floating down the river. Oh, I got this today. I got to do this. There goes your control. Oh, I have to write so-and-so a card. Oh, there goes your affection. More thoughts come down the river, and you're thinking, oh, I wonder if I have enough medicine to get through the week. Oh, there goes your security. So the whole time, these thoughts are going to be floating down the river on these little boats. And your word You go back to your word so that you don't jump on one of those boats. And found that you've gone way down the rabbit hole, so to speak. You followed that one thought all the way, and you've worked out the solution, and now you're ready to get up and go and do it. Whoa, you've been stolen by that thought. So the word brings you back, and you want to go deeper in the river, and you don't want to stay on the surface. This, my friends, I'm convinced, is what Clare was able to do. That she was able to give herself over totally to the Lord's work in her during her prayer time. There was no other way that I could figure that she could go about in her day and do the incredible kinds of loving that she did. Not one sister who was giving testimony ever said even Mother Teresa was normal in the sense that she had some bad days. But there was not one testimony of Clare having ever told a sister off or, made some crude remarks about these popes that were trying to run them, or she never despaired when they were running out of food, or they were freezing, or so many of them were sick. There was never a hint of her being able to do anything but operate under the Lord's grace. And this daily prayer helps us not to get tripped up on those ego motivations, because we become aware of them when we're doing them. So I complained earlier about the heat. Where was my security? Where was my feeling comfortable? Okay? But so many times we click off into anger. And if we could just stop and say, why am I angry? Okay, let it go. Before we operate out of it. Centering prayer allows us to do that. So when we look at Clare's method of look, gaze, and now consider what you're gazing. Consider this piece of scripture. Consider the dignity of this person in front of you. Consider where this other person's coming from. Consider the call God is giving you. Contemplate. And that's when you're sitting in centering prayer and just giving it over to the Lord. And I tell people, start at 5 minutes a day, 5 in the morning, 5 in the evening, and then increase it up to 20 if you can. But that's how Clare was able to do what she did during the day, whether sick or well. So hers was about searching for that deep river inside. Remember, we're spiritual beings. Sometimes we operate like we're just bodily beings with a great mind. Well, we do have beautiful bodies and we do have great minds, but we are spiritual beings in this body. And the spiritual you is what's going to live on forever. And that's the spirit that you want to be attentive to, not the ego, because the ego is the one that's living in fear. But the spiritual being wants to be attentive to the Lord throughout the day. And that's where Clare is calling us to. So Clare would say, look at all of the descriptors of God. Okay, so let's take a minute right here, right now. Call out whatever word you would use to describe God. Compassion. Loving. Forgiving. Restful. Oh, trusting. Gentle. Forgiving. Humorous, indeed. Merciful. Faithful. Okay, if I had a blackboard here, we'd write them down until we filled it up. That's who you are in the center. Thomas Merton would say, within each of us, there is a place. And that place, that point of being, is where God dwells. And nothing can touch it, not even you. Nobody can change it. Nobody can lose it. No matter what anybody does, they can never lose that. Even the Hitlers of the world cannot lose that. It just depends on how far their ego has taken them away from realizing this divinity within them. So we are spiritual beings trying to always work out of that divinity. So if we wrote down on the board all of those descriptors of God, that's what we're called to imitate. That's what Clare is saying. Okay, that's your model. That's what we have to practice. That's how we have to be if we are going to live as spiritual beings and not egoic beings, or egomaniacs, as some people call them. So for us to think about Clare as a model for us as a contemplative, I would bring it down to something as simple as Clare would say, look at Jesus and be the mirror for other people. So here's Jesus and here's you. And when you turn around to others, what they should see is Jesus. So her spirituality is she writes beautifully in her letters, and I could quote you, but basically all of them say the same thing, that get rid of anything, any alienating image in you that does not speak of Jesus, that's working out of something else. And I just gave you examples. But when you're working out of those, you are not mirroring Christ. Christ had no ego. Christ was not about his own security. Jesus was never about wanting to be esteemed. Christ was never about wanting to make sure that he had power and control. And if you want to see that in the Gospels, just look at the readings for today. Jesus was led to the desert. Why? Well, immediately the Spirit brings him to the desert, and I think to question, you are my beloved Son. What does that mean? So he's 40 days trying to understand that call to be beloved. Each of us are called to be the beloved. So he's trying to grapple with what does that mean to be the beloved, and here comes the devil saying, I'll give you all these kingdoms. Here's bread. I know you're starving to death. Throw yourself down and prove to me that you're special and you can save yourself. Power, esteem, security. And Jesus says, no way. That's not who I am. So this is what Clare was looking at. Nothing in you that's alienating to the image of Christ. That we need to see traces of Christ in others as well. And if we can't see it, then ask Jesus to help us, to show us how to see it. Because there will be people who are broken, and it's hard for us to see Jesus in them. But guess what? We're broken too. And so if it's like the Chinese, when they have something very valuable, like a vase that's been broken, you know what they do? They cover up, or they paint, I should say, the broken places with gold so that the light can show through. And so we use our broken places to be a place where Jesus' love can show through. I'm thinking of suffering. There's a broken place. Anybody in this room not ever had any suffering? Okay, so you've had physical suffering. You've had probably mental suffering, loss of a job, or not understanding, or maybe even becoming forgetful. So you've had suffering physically, mentally, emotionally, particularly the death of a loved one, or another kind of dying that you've had to go through, giving up a dream, or plans not working out. And it's out of those sufferings that our heart breaks open. So I'd like to end today with a healing experience where we will pray for each other in healing. And so while we're getting ready for that, I would ask that you think about the ways in which you personally might need healing. It might be physical, bless you. It might be something spiritual. It might be an emotional healing that you need. And then carry somebody with you. By that I mean, bring up someone else who has asked you to pray for them, or someone who is a concern, someone who maybe didn't ask you, but somebody that you know needs healing.
How St. Clare cured 5 sick sisters with the sign of the cross, as witnessed by Sister Pacifica. This witness also said one time when 5 sisters were sick in the monastery, St. Clare made the sign of the cross with her own hand over them, and all of them were immediately cured. Frequently, when one of the sisters had some pain, either the head or another part of the body, the Blessed Mother cured her with the sign of the cross. Asked how she knew the things mentioned, she replied she was present. Asked who the 5 sisters were, she replied that she, the witness, was one. Some of the others had died, others were living, but she did not remember whom. Asked the length of time she, the witness, was sick, she replied it was a long time. Asked what the sickness was, she replied it was one that made her shriek, have a great fever, and shake. Asked about the others who had been cured, the length of time they had been sick, she replied she did not remember about the others as about herself. Asked when those sisters were cured, she replied, before the lady was sick. Asked about the time St. Clare began that long illness, she replied she believed it was 29 years. She also said the medicine of that witness and of the other sisters when they were sick was that their mother made the sign of the cross over them. Asked what words the Lady Clare used to speak when she made the sign of the cross, she replied they did not understand her because she spoke so softly. Asked about the month and the day that she, the witness, and the other sisters were cured, she replied she did not remember. And asked who was present when they were cured, she replied more sisters were present, but she did not remember how many nor who.
Our response is, O Lord, be gracious to me and heal me. May are those who consider the poor. The Lord delivers them in the day of trouble. The Lord protects them and keeps them alive. They are called happy in the land. The Lord be gracious to me and heal me. Do not give them up.
The Lord sustains them on their sickbed.
Let their illness heal all their infirmities. O Lord, be gracious to me and heal me. As for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me. Heal me, for I have sinned against you.
Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from
everlasting to everlasting. Amen. Amen.
O Lord,
Be gracious to me.
and heal me.